As a somatic experiencing practitioner, we help the nervous system to get unstuck from survival responses. At the age of 20, I experienced an assault by a stranger who was helping me to change my flat tire. Trauma isn't over until the nervous system says it's over, right? Like in our mind, we know like that experience is gone, but why is my body still reacting in this way? You can't think your way out of anxiety. You can't talk your way out of depression. You have to feel your way out. The nervous system has a hierarchy of how it responds to stress or triggers. You can think of it like there's 3 sections. At the top of the ladder is the ventral vagal state. This is where we feel safe enough to connect with the world around us. The middle state is the sympathetic response of fight or flight. At the bottom of the ladder is our shutdown response. The deeper their level of shutdown, the deeper their depression, their burnout. That's usually a direct mirror of how much their system is suppressing. Functional freeze is I'm going through the motions with no emotion. I'm on autopilot.
People talking about losing their spark. How can you get your life force back?
Life force is healthy aggression. We've been conditioned as a society to look at anger as this bad, destructive thing. Anger is incredibly important.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's episode. Today's guest is Brittany Piper. She's an internationally recognized speaker, author, and somatic experiencing practitioner. In her upcoming book, Body First Healing, Brittany offers a revolutionary guide to trauma recovery through healing the nervous system. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I love your show. I love your podcast. So I'm just really excited
thank
to
you
talk
so
today.
much. I'm so excited to talk to you about the nervous system and trauma. I read your book and I thought it was fantastic. So I'm really excited for this episode.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
How are you?
I'm good. It's starting to warm up where I live, so that makes things nice. I have the windows open today. But yeah, I'm good.
That always makes things so much better for the nervous system as well, right? Like getting fresh air, sunshine.
Absolutely. It definitely does. It's actually one of my favorite ways to really regulate is being out in nature. Yeah.
Mine too, 100% is the fastest way for me.
Yeah.
But can you start off by telling us a bit, what is somatic experiencing and how does it help you with healing trauma?
Yeah. So somatic experiencing, I think a lot of people are, we could say, more familiar with the term somatic healing, but soma means body-based or body-oriented, and somatic experiencing is a naturalistic, body-based trauma resolution modality. So as a somatic experiencing practitioner, we're trained to work with body memory and how trauma shows up in the body rather than working just specifically with like conscious, cognitive, or explicit memory, which is a lot of what you do in, cognitive behavioral therapy, conventional therapy. So we help the body to essentially, and the nervous system to get unstuck from survival responses. We hold the belief based on a lot of the upgraded science that trauma is any experience that overwhelms the nervous system. And when that happens, your nervous system can essentially get stuck in what we call the stress or the threat response cycle. And so we get kind of stuck in like this loop of survival. And we more specifically get stuck in the states that helped us to survive. So it could be the flight response, the fight response, fawn, shutdown, functional freeze, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
We'll talk all of it.
Yeah. So what we do is we facilitate the body and the nervous system's ability and capacity to know and to show that trauma has passed and that we don't need to be stuck in survival mode anymore. And there's a lot of steps that go into that, but that's kind of the basics, is that we work with the body and healing trauma through the imprints of the body.
That's so interesting. And can you tell me a bit about your story and, what made you want to become a somatic experiencing practitioner?
Yeah. So my story goes back pretty far. I had been in and out of, I guess we could say, traditional therapy for most of my life. I had experienced trauma from birth. So when I was born, I was actually taken from my mother and put into foster care.
Oh,
forcibly removed because there was methamphetamine found in her system.
oh my
Um,
God.
yeah. And then, we can also talk back to like generational trauma and what gets transmitted and transferred and passed down. But trauma really started for me when I was in the womb. And although I was reunited with my mom after a few months, I grew up in an environment where there was a lot of emotional disconnect with my caregivers. And I was a really anxious child. And kind of those seeds of like abandonment and just wanting to be accepted really showed up in my life. And so, and my mom worked a lot. She worked half the week, like Monday through Friday, in a completely different state, and so I didn't see her a lot.
Wow.
Yeah, and it wasn't until I became a mom myself that I realized that that was kind of my first experiences of trauma. And I actually
Mm.
didn't learn or know about my birth until I was a teenager. But I was already experiencing a lot of the emotional, right, imprints of that and some of the behavioral imprints. And then I lost my brother to a car accident when I was in high school. He passed away.
I'm so
And
sorry.
thank you. Yeah, and that was 21 years ago. And I think that was kind of my first kind of in your face trauma, shock trauma, if you will.
Mm.
And I didn't handle it very well. I'm using air quotes here because I don't know what handling it well really means, but I wasn't really like we all didn't handle it well as a family. And I grew up where in an environment where we got really good at like, hiding things, putting things under the rug, pretending like it didn't happen. But what you avoid, eventually you will need to face. And like avoiding things isn't the same thing as healing and processing them. And so I went down a pretty dark path. I relied heavily on drugs and alcohol. And it got me into some pretty bad situations. I ended up in the hospital with alcohol poisoning when I was 20. I'm sorry, when I was 19. And then at the age of 20, I then experienced an assault by a stranger who was helping me to change my flat tire.
Oh my
And that
gosh.
was, yeah, that was kind of, the rock bottom moment for me. Um, my life for the next 2 years, because he was eventually caught, and then there was this 2-year trial process. During that time, on the outside, I looked to seem to have it together. People would always ask me like, "You're holding it together so well," but internally and behind the scenes, I again
Mm.
was really struggling. And again, I just want to point out that I was in and out of therapy. That in all of that through most of this time, was also on a lot of different medications, anti-anxiety, depression medication. But I still kept hitting these roadblocks and I still kept reaching for alcohol and substances. And after that 2-year trial period, my perpetrator was sentenced to 60 years behind bars. But then 30 days after the sentencing, when the trial came to an end, I found myself in a really bad situation. I was out with my partner who was drinking and driving. And I always say that's a really good like indication of where I was at the time in my life, the fact that I put myself in that situation. And when the police officers went to arrest him and then pull me out of the car just to give me a ride home, in that moment, in my own impaired state, I had a flashback of the night of my assault, being touched by a man in a car by a stranger. And my body just kind of autonomically went into this fight response. And
Mm.
now, knowing what I know now, I know that that was a trauma reenactment. And my nervous system was trying to complete the incomplete experience of that original trauma. Because I did try to fight back when the assault happened, but I was overpowered. And so I ended up being arrested myself. And in those 3 days that I sat in that jail cell, I experienced things in my body that I had never experienced before. There was a lot of emotion, trembling, shaking, a lot of sweating. It felt like a detox. Like I had never experienced anything like
Mm.
that. And after those 3 days, I went before the judge and she said, "I know who you are. You're the survivor from the sexual assault case." She said, "We're going to drop the charges, but you need to learn to live with your trauma better." And that was kind of a
Mm.
turning point for me because I think for so long it had been modeled to me to like avoid the pain, avoid the trauma, run from it. And she didn't say that. She didn't say get past it, get over it. She said you need to learn to live with it. And so that changed the trajectory of my recovery. And I also got really curious because I felt like a totally different person when I left that jail cell. Like my body felt physically, emotionally different. And I got really curious about that. So I went down this rabbit hole of like, how does trauma impact the body? And that
Mm.
was 15 years ago now
Mm.
that I was in that jail cell. And yeah, it really opened up this whole world of somatics and somatic therapy. I started doing more body-based recovery work, and my life transformed pretty quickly
Mm.
when I did that. So that's kind of that's the very long story of how I've ended up here. But yeah, a lot of my professional research started off as me search, I like to say.
As it usually does.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's so
Mhm.
impactful and so important. And I think a lot of people can resonate with at least certain parts of that story. The emotional neglect that a lot of people experience in the childhood and going through these really hard life experiences. So,
Yeah,
yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
of course.
And how would you define trauma?
Yeah, so trauma, I view it as anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think I might have mentioned it earlier, so I might sound redundant, but the best definition that I find is that it's any experience or event that overwhelms the nervous system's capacity to cope. And when that happens, we get stuck in the trauma. And not only do we get stuck in the trauma, it's like our body becomes the trauma, right?
Mm.
Um, and so I'm of the belief that, and a lot of this upgraded science shows that trauma isn't over until the nervous system says it's over, right? Like in our
Mm.
mind, we know like that experience is gone, that experience has passed. I'm no longer living in that environment, or that person is no longer around me, or that horrific accident, that was a long time ago, but why is my body still reacting in this way? Why am I still
Mm-hmm.
getting triggered in this way? And so trauma doesn't really come back so much as a conscious story, even though it can. It more so shows up in our everyday reactions and impulses. And that's the loop of the nervous system, right? So yeah, trauma is anything that overwhelms the nervous system, then creating this kind of experience where we're stuck in survival mode, seemingly still trying to survive what is already past.
Mm. What do you think are some trauma misconceptions that people have?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot out there, as I'm sure you've heard. And I don't fault anyone because again, we've learned so much. There was an advancement in medical technology around the early 2000s. We had access to neuroimaging, and a lot of these neuroimaging studies provided a lot of like revolutionary knowledge around trauma. And I think that they say it takes roughly, they say 17 to 20 years for new science to emerge in mainstream medicine. And I feel like that's where we are now. Like we're at that place where there's this big wave of science that's been around for a long time, and people have been doing it kind of, in the corner of the room. They used to say it was like a fringe movement, somatic healing. A lot of people have been doing this for a long time with a lot of success. It's just not mainstream. But in the mainstream perspective, trauma is anything that is shocking and overwhelming, and it's an event. And the way that I like to kind of challenge that is that trauma is anything that feels like, not anything that we think is, but anything that feels like too much, too fast, too soon, or not enough for the nervous
Mm.
system. I also am not a big fan of the phrase big T and little t trauma, because trauma is so relative to each unique person and nervous system. So, like, for instance, let's say that, and I use this example in the book. I love this example. Like, Johnny and Freddie are two young kids who are living next door to each other. And Johnny comes from a home where one parent is off working a lot. The other parent is home with, maybe substance abuse, right? Issues. And so Johnny doesn't feel exactly safe in this home, right? He doesn't feel supported, seen, attuned to by his attachment caregivers. Freddie, though, on the other hand, and I hope I didn't mix them up, but Freddie, on the other hand, he comes from a home where caregivers are present, physically present, they are attuned, and it feels like a safe environment for him, right? Emotionally, physically, mentally. They both get on the bus one day, Johnny and Freddie, and they're both bullied in the exact same way, by the same bully. Now, Johnny goes home to an environment where that caregiver is off on another work trip again, and the other caregiver is asleep on the couch. And when he goes to wake them up, they scream at him, "Go to your room. I don't want to deal with your stuff. I don't want to hear about what happened on the bus today. Just leave me alone." Right? Like, for Johnny, that does not feel supportive. And so he's all in his fight or flight response, or his shutdown response. He retreats to his room, he withdraws, and he sits there in his activation. He's still stuck in survival mode. Whereas Freddie, again, I hope I'm not switching these back and forth, but Freddie
We
goes
get the
home.
point. It's
Yeah,
okay. I can't
yeah.
remember the names
Yeah.
either.
I'm like, it's too early. I need coffee. Freddie, on the other hand, he goes home. Parents are there, right? And they sit with him. They help his nervous system to regulate because he's young and he doesn't know how to regulate his own system yet. They help him to process the emotions that are arising. They help him to, release what is coming up in his body. And then they sit with him. They offer him comfort. They talk it through. And then they say, "We're going to reach out to the principal tomorrow and make sure that this never happens again." Right. So for Freddie, he feels safe. His armor of the nervous system is able to, okay, I'm safe now. I can take this armor off. Whereas Johnny, he remains armored up, and he might look back on that experience in his life years later and be like, "That was traumatic for me." Whereas Freddie is like, "That was a blip on my radar. That didn't feel traumatic." And so when we talk about big T and little t trauma, like, it's so easy to put trauma into boxes. And again, it's so relative to the nervous system that we have at the time, the environment that we're in, and whether or not our system is allowed to feel safe afterwards. So that's another big misconception. And then I would say just the last thing is that in the somatic world, we work a lot with because we work with body memory, we work a lot with pre-verbal trauma. So trauma that happens usually before the age of 2 to 3 years old in infancy, and then even in utero. So I was talking earlier about how there's, traumatic memory, and it's in our space, we work with body memory, implicit memory. And this includes like emotional memory, sensory memory, muscle memory, like how do we ride a bike, right? How do we stand? Autonomic nervous system memory, and procedural memory. Okay. That's implicit body memory. That's what we work with. The impulses of the body, the emotion, the sensorial memory. That memory starts to form when we are 7 weeks in the womb, 7 weeks gestation. And so even though we might not be able to remember our trauma explicitly, right? And then there's explicit trauma, which is verbal trauma that you can explain. That starts to form around the age of 2 to 3. Even though we might not be able to explicitly remember the event, the body still remembers how it feels. And so trauma, again, it's not found in the story, it's found in the nervous system. And that's what we work with, is body memory.
And
And
what
there's a
is the
lot more
role?
misconceptions, but I'll just keep it short at that. There's so many.
You don't have to. You can go on as long as you want. This is
Yeah.
all really interesting. But
Thank you.
I know you mentioned this before, but I'd like to know more about, what is the role of the nervous system when it comes to trauma?
Yeah. So, the nervous system is, I would say, it's one of the most important systems in the body and the brain. And the nervous system governs, and it actually dictates a lot of our thought processes. It dictates our behavior, our impulses, our reactions. It dictates how we live and feel in our body. So it governs over our viscera, our organs, our musculoskeletal system, our hormones. It has a direct correlation to, or a direct relationship to all of these things. And so if our nervous system is stuck in a state of survival, what that means is that there is going to be a body-wide, or what we call a system-wide response. So our brain is going to change. Our thought patterns are going to change. We always say it's your state that creates your story. So whatever nervous system state you're in is really going to inform the thoughts or the stories in your mind. If you're in a fight response, you're going to be pissed off at everyone, right? Like, I'm pissed off at the world. I'm pissed off at the TV today. I'm pissed off at those birds. I'm just pissed off at everything. And so there's no amount of like willing your way or thinking your way into regulation or thinking your way out of that, because the nervous system doesn't operate from the thinking part of the brain, the cognitive part of the brain. It operates from the subconscious, subcortical part of the brain, which is emotion, feeling, sensation, and impulse, which is why we always say you can't really think your way, or you can't think your way out of anxiety. You can't talk your way out of depression. You have to show or feel your way out. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but we could talk about the nervous system till I'm blue in the face for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And it's so true. I mean, I see myself, the thing that helps the most when I'm, dysregulated in any way, either angry or anxious, it's not like thinking about it and thinking of, what I can do. It's going outside for a walk, or like running, or stretching my body, moving, eating something. It's like getting in my body, not in my mind.
Yes.
So I really relate to what you said.
Yeah. And that reminds me out of your body out of your mind and into your body. There's I don't know who quoted it, but there's a lovely saying in the somatic space that healing happens when you get out of your head and into your body. And I really do think that is so true. And part of the science behind that, some of the science that came out in the 90s with the polyvagal theory, which is the new I keep saying upgraded science. What I'm referring to is the polyvagal theory, which is research that was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges. And it's the upgraded science of the nervous system. But polyvagal, the word vagal, is referring to the vagus nerve. We see a lot like, vagus nerve stimulation and a lot of vagus nerve exercises and how they relate to the nervous system. But what he found in his research is that we have this wonderful nerve that runs through our body called the vagus nerve. And you can think of it like the information superhighway. And so, but vagus means wanderer in Latin. And it's called the vagus nerve because it touches every major organ in our body and it connects to the brain. But what he found, and what we found in the research, is that vagus nerve, which goes up and down from body to brain and from brain to body, 80% of those messages of this information superhighway are from body to brain, which are efferent fibers. And only 20% of the messages on this information superhighway are from the brain down to the body, which are afferent fibers, which means that the body has a lot more say into how we feel, how we think, how we react, compared to the mind, which is why, again, like just getting into your body can be such a quicker, such a quicker way to regulate rather than trying to think your way there.
Yeah, I remember reading in your book about the polyvagal theory and also the polyvagal ladder. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So in Porges's work, one of the things that he created was the polyvagal ladder, which essentially helps us to understand that the nervous system has a hierarchy or a predictable pathway of how it responds to stress or triggers. And so this ladder, you can think of it like there's 3 sections. There's the top of the ladder, you come down to the middle of the ladder, and then there's the bottom of the ladder. And at the top of the ladder is the ventral vagal state, otherwise what we commonly refer to as rest and digest. But this is where we feel safe and connected to our bodies. We feel safe and connected, or safe enough, we could say, to connect with other people, and safe enough to connect with the world around us. So we're up here at the top of the ladder. Now, the predictable pathway, when we feel stress or a trigger, when the body senses that, the body automatically or autonomically comes down to the middle state of that ladder, which is the sympathetic response of fight or flight. And so when this happens, we are essentially flooded with the mobilizing hormones of adrenaline and cortisol that help us to fight or flee. This is why when you're in a fight response, right, you feel like a lot of adrenaline, you feel heated, you feel like, or you're in a flight response, which is usually fear-based anxiety, right? You start to feel really sweaty, hot, panicky, you get fidgety. This is the body mobilizing that adrenaline and cortisol. And then at the bottom of the ladder, the next predictable state at the bottom is our shutdown response, which we used to consider our freeze response, but this is the dorsal vagal collapse. It's kind of like a freeze response. But here we are not mobilized, we are now immobilized. You can kind of think of it like your hibernation state. Like this is where you're conserving energy. I like the analogy of like when you're in fight or flight, you can imagine that your foot is on the gas pedal of a car, like you're mobilizing and going. And then we end up down in dorsal or shutdown when the emergency brake needs to happen because the system's like, whoa, something is too much, we cannot fight or flee. Or when we have gone pedal to the metal in fight or flight and our system's like, we are burnt out. So burnout, depression, fatigue, that commonly lives down in our shutdown state. But what's important to know, and this is a state where you feel really disconnected. And I'll give you kind of the cheat sheet here is your top state of ventral is your state of connection. Your middle state of fight or flight is the state of protection, active protection. And then the bottom state of dorsal shutdown is a state of disconnection. Right? So we isolate, we withdraw, we often disconnect from our own bodies. So a lot of dissociation happens here. But what I wanted to say is that when we're down in shutdown, all of that adrenaline and cortisol is still there. It's just that it's being suppressed and kind of hidden away and not being used. And so when we go back up the nervous system ladder, we can't Spider-Man our way to the top. We have to go through fight or flight. And this is what we do in somatic experiencing is we facilitate the ability for our clients to gently start to come up that ladder and do what we call discharging. So Peter Levine's work, the developer of somatic experiencing, he and Porges actually are very close colleagues. And so there's a lot of blending of the two modalities of polyvagal theory and somatic experiencing. But Peter's work was based on, I think it's ethnology. I always get it confused. Ethology and ethnology, but the study of animals in the wild. And that's why his first book is called Waking the Tiger. We have the same nervous system as animals. We are just human animals, but our nervous systems operate in the same way. And so through observation of animals in the wild, he found that when animals go into these activated states of survival, following the moments where the threat has ended, their bodies do things like shaking, shuddering, trembling, right? And in our society, in our kind of modern human culture, we have been conditioned to believe that it's not okay to be with charge, to be with shaking, right? Like, oh no, I just need to calm down. I need to breathe it out, right? And so what we do as somatic practitioners, somatic experiencing is we know that that adrenaline and cortisol has to be released or what we call discharge from the body. So moving up the ladder, we employ very gentle somatic practices, or we just allow space and guidance for our clients' bodies to discharge that activation or the adrenaline and cortisol on its own. And you can think of it like a pressure cooker, like we're just gently lifting the lid and gently lifting the lid. And when that happens, the body completes its stress response cycle and it comes back up to the top of the ladder. And then the last thing I'll add is that a lot of people assume that regulation means staying at the top of the ladder all day long. And that's not what regulation is. Regulation, a regulated nervous system, its natural biorhythm, it actually goes up and down that ladder probably roughly 100 times a day. And that's what we call a flexible nervous system, a resilient nervous system. It can move in and out of stress and activation without getting stuck. A dysregulated nervous system is one that's stuck in a survival state, a system that we would call rigid. So yeah, that's the polyvagal ladder.
Wow, that was so fascinating. And I can see it so much, in my day-to-day life or with my clients or just people in general. If they are in a state of, stuck, depressed, is it dorsal you called it?
Cortisol. Uh-huh. Yep.
They usually have to go through that, that state of anger. They either get really angry, they acknowledge what has been done to them, or whatever, to actually move into the other one. But it usually comes with anger, or those fight or flight responses you were talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. So the system is usually down and shut down because of some thwarted response within the nervous system. And so, yeah, we have to go back up through fight or flight because at one point, fight or flight felt unsafe.
Mhm.
And so it's allowing the nervous system to do now what it couldn't do back then in a way that feels safe and tolerable so that we can bring the nervous system into what we call somatic completion. We can somatically complete that incomplete experience. But this shows up in our everyday life. Like our nervous system is always trying to like, wait, can I complete this? Can I complete this?
Hmm.
Right. And so that's that loop that we kind of get stuck in. But I also like to say as well that typically what I find in working with clients is that the deeper their level of shutdown, the deeper their depression, their burnout, their fatigue, their dissociation, that's usually a direct mirror of how much their system is suppressing, how much
Mm.
activation it's holding down. And we always use the example of like a beach ball, pushing a beach ball inflated like under the water, the amount of energy that it takes from the body to suppress the emotional charge of like anger and fear is so intense. And over time, that just creates like it's exhausting. And then it creates inflammation, it creates fatigue, it creates pain and chronic illness. So a lot of the clients that I work with, they are really struggling with things like fibromyalgia or, CFS or more of those chronic conditions like migraines, insomnia, TMJ. And that's just the wear and tear over time of the nervous system and the body trying to contain and hold it all in.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you call that dorsal state? Is it functional freeze? Would you call that functional freeze?
Yeah. So,
And
oh no, good. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was gonna say, what are some signs that someone is living in functional freeze?
Yeah. So, we have the main three nervous system states. And then outside of those, we also have blended states. Right. So technically, the new terminology around our three nervous system states is not fight, flight, freeze. Excuse me. It's now ventral, which is what we consider safety and connection, fight or flight, which is sympathetic, and then dorsal, which is shut down. Um, and freeze, and then we have what we call blended states, okay, which are mixed states. They're exactly like they sound. They're a little bit of one state and a little bit of another. But some of the most popular blended states that we see are the fawn response, right? So people often say fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Fawn is one of them. And this is a blended state of like your flight response because there's a lot of fear, like fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of not being accepted, right? Fear of disconnection. And so this fear then guides us to like overcompensate, people please, right? Like chase other people, be quick to resolution, forego our boundaries. But the blended state there is flight and then shut down because there's also parts of us that we are shutting down and disconnecting from, like our wants, our needs, our boundaries, right? Our power, what's important to us. We are shutting that down and suppressing it. So functional freeze, I'll just go through some of the other blended states. So freeze is a blended state. Okay, dorsal is more so like being really shut down and being immobilized and in hibernation, right? And it's kind of like a collapsed state. Your freeze response is more like a deer in the headlights. It's where on the outside we are completely frozen and petrified, but inside there is so much activation, right? So we can get frozen in fear. We can get frozen in anger where we freeze. So it's a blended response of sympathetic and dorsal as well. And your freeze response doesn't typically last long. It's called the tonic immobility response. And then there's functional freeze, which we see a lot of today. So that's a blended response as well of your fight or flight response, usually your flight response, and shutdown. And what this looks like is not I'm collapsed and I'm in hibernation and it's hard for me to get out of bed. It doesn't look like I'm frozen in place. Functional freeze is I'm going through the motions with no emotion, right? Like I'm armored up and I'm holding it all in and I'm getting through the day and I'm on autopilot. And
Mm.
that's a lot of what we see today is that people are really kind of living in their heads, but completely disconnected from their bodies. They're functioning, they're going to work, they're getting things done, they're being productive, which is that healthy adrenaline and cortisol of the flight response. But there is a lot of suppressed emotional charge below the surface. And then the flight response, I should maybe say how the flight response is different. The flight response looks like a lot of fear, anxiety, panic, and worry, right? So we are staying busy, but there's a lot of fear that's really present as well. So
Mm.
yeah, that's
And
how
this,
functional freeze shows up.
mm-hmm. Very interesting. And these are the 5 stuck personality types.
Yeah, so the 5 stuck personality types is we could say a concept that I created when I wrote the book Body First Healing. And these are the kind of the 5 stuck nervous system states that I see most commonly when I work with clients. And that is the fight response, the flight response, the shutdown response, the fawn response, and the functional freeze response. So yeah, that's one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I should say
And
the functional freeze response is really glorified in today's culture.
is
Right.
it?
Yeah. Yeah. Because the functional freeze response, we seemingly look like we have it all together on the outside. So you might hear things like, gosh, they just don't let anything bother them, or they're just like so
Mm.
resilient, or like they just say yes to everything, or they're so they're so unbothered. And that's more like being able to access boundaries, being able to access moments where we're frustrated or where we do feel anxiety. That's really important, right? Because emotional suppression over time, again, think of that pressure cooker. All of those emotions come with that physiological charge, and if we're not facing it one day, it'll catch up with us in the future.
100%. And yeah, I see it every day how people avoid their feelings. How I
Mhm.
sometimes avoid my feelings, dumb scrolling and just like going through the day, but being completely disconnected.
Yeah,
And sometimes what I find so interesting is for myself, I would sometimes, be very disconnected for a period of time. And then the way my body gets me to connect back to is like by crying or like by
yeah,
starting to feel like, oh my god, like it's bursting something, the lid is coming off, it's bursting, and then I'm like crying or something,
yeah,
all of a sudden. So yeah, that's really really interesting.
yeah.
um my next question is, where does brain fog come from and how can you get rid of it?
Yeah, brain fog. So, I mean, we could say it could come from a number of places, but brain fog, how I would view that is that is more so of like a certain kind of a dissociative experience. So when we talk about dissociation, we're talking about how we can leave ourselves, and like our body and our nervous system and our brain have this wonderful way. They have all of these wonderful ways of brilliantly keeping us protected, right, from anything
Mm.
that doesn't feel comfortable. And so one way that can happen is brain fog. So if things feel like too much in our minds, right, we can start to feel just kind of foggy and groggy. And that might be a sign of a certain kind of dissociation. Like, so there's primary dissociation, there's secondary dissociation, there's tertiary dissociation, and I won't go into each one, but essentially there are dissociations where we might leave like our mind, like we're kind of spacey, but we're here in our bodies, right? We feel our body. Another kind of dissociation is like, I'm here, I'm here mentally, but there are certain parts of my body that don't feel here right now. Like I'm not really feeling my feet, or I feel kind of numb. And then there's another kind of dissociation where we are super internally present. Like I feel so present with my mind and my thoughts and my body, but I feel completely dissociated with the world around me. So it's like the world around
Mm.
us is kind of blurry and like going by. And so these are just, kind of protective strategies that the body and the nervous system enlist in moments when things feel too overwhelming. Now, I will say that when we are in a more regulated state of like ventral, okay, up at the top of the nervous system ladder, that is when our prefrontal cortex, which is like our creative, cognitive, clarity part of our brain, that's when that is really activated. Now, when we go down the nervous system ladder, you can think of the prefrontal cortex, like the thinking part of the brain, as the operating center. Okay. Like a computer. And when we go
Mhm.
down the ladder, the backup operating system takes over, which is the amygdala. And that's the threat center of the brain. And so the amygdala, we call it amygdala hijacking. The amygdala, which is the irrational brain, takes over, right? And we go into survival mode. But when that happens, the prefrontal cortex gets disrupted, and or in some cases disconnected. And so logical thinking, rationale, right? Some of that can go out the window. And so brain fog can come there too.
That's so interesting. And so many people experience it, brain fog. So I think this will be really useful for a lot of people.
Yeah,
Um, and what do you think of the saying, change your thoughts, change your life?
I don't love it.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's it means well, but it's not grounded in a lot of the new science. And um I think it should be you know, change your thoughts, change your nervous system, change your thoughts, change your life, right?
Mm.
I think all of those things should really be at play there. And it also goes back to like, the saying, I don't remember if it was Pierre Genet or who said it, maybe Freud. I can't remember. Someone said, I think, therefore I am, right? And I think up until the past maybe 10 years, 10 to 15 years, really when the body keeps the score. It's funny. I have the body keeps the score right in front of me, right on top of
Mm.
my book. But this book, I believe, came out in 2014 and it became a bestseller in 2017. Um,
Mm.
but for a long time, people held the mind and the brain, and I don't want to say the brain, maybe the subconscious mind and mindset as really the one thing that moves the needle forward when it comes to healing. And I like to look at it as that's one piece of the pie, but the body is also there too. And we can't practice mindset work or positive thinking or affirmations if we're not also focusing on the body.
Mhm.
I think both things are really important. Anyways, what I was saying is there's that saying, I think therefore I am, and I think it should really read I feel therefore I am, because we know that the body is really in the driver's seat. Yeah.
100%. And
Mhm.
yeah, I agree. And I know you said at the beginning that you were an anxious kid. Is your background an anxious attachment?
It sure
And
is.
okay, cool. I think a lot of our listeners are, have that background or have an anxious attachment. So, how can you move from an anxious attachment into a more secure one?
Yeah. So, attachment wounds, or we could just say relational wounds, they heal in relationships. And
Mm.
I think oftentimes people will think like, well, I need to focus on the relationship with myself first before I get into any kind of relationship. But the old patterns and the old muscle memory and the old impulse to, let's just talk specifically about anxious attachment, the impulse and the wiring to chase, right? To become clingy, you could say, to be anxious. Those patterns will only change if you're in a relationship that shows you otherwise. And
Mm.
so we call that earned secure attachment, which they say can take I believe it's 2 to 3 years, okay, where we can earn a dominant, secure attachment style. And that's not to say a lot of people too assume that attachment styles is that we are one style and that's it. But we're actually, our attachment styles are very fluid. We are all styles. It's just that one style might be more dominant than the others. And so for me, for a large portion of my relationship experience, I was a serial monogamist. I went from 1 2 year serious relationship to the next 2 year serious. Like I did that for years. Um, and I made my entire life, like I was consumed with my relationships. And I often attracted people that, which makes sense, right? We repeat what we had early on. But I often attracted people who seemed disinterested, who were emotionally avoidant, who didn't give a lot of affection or validation, who were maybe even abusive and not good for me. And what that did is it just validated again that impulse and that loop that my nervous system was stuck in, which is we need to be fearful that they are going to leave and chase and cling. So the relationship I have now with my husband, he was kind of that way. He's more of an avoidant. You could say he was more avoidant at the time. But also like very loving. It's just that he liked his independence. So he was very kind. He was very patient with me. But it was more so that he wanted me to have a life outside of our relationship. And I remember when I was 24, we'd been dating for a couple of years. I had an opportunity to work overseas for a couple of months. And I like didn't want to go. And this would be huge for my job and my career. And I remember him saying, because I was scared of leaving him. Like, well, what's going to happen? Is he going to stick around? And I remember him saying, I can't complete your life. I can only complement it. Like, only you can do that for yourself. And he encouraged me to build a life outside of the relationship. And it was the consistent and habitual experiences of me showing up for him. He had his attachment wounds, which is why he was avoidant, but me consistently showing up and not leaving, which proved to his security system, which proved to his nervous system that he could have a different experience. And then for me, it was the consistent experience of he and I can have distance and he's not going to leave. He and I can have our own lives and we're not going to leave. And it was that habitual experience over time that created new expectations in the relationships, new subconscious patterns, but that did take time. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And I think, people love to preach independence and saying, no, you have to heal first and then you can get in a relationship. And it's
Yeah.
like, it doesn't really work like that because the healing
Mhm.
happens in the relationship most of the times.
Yes,
And, of course, there's the inner work part, but the most
absolutely.
powerful way to transform your attachment style is in a relationship. And that security, and as you said, like rewiring your brain to understand that, okay, so they're safe to, they're not going to leave me, or
Hmm.
whatever your attachment style is telling you.
Exactly.
um I also know that in your book you talked about self-attunement. Can you tell
Mm,
me more about what that is?
yeah. So I think that's a perfect segue because you were just talking about the relationship that we have with ourselves. And attunement is a term that's used a lot in the attachment world. So I have a background in attachment as well, somatic attachment. But when we talk about attachment, which is the relationship, attachment starts with the relationship that you have with your primary caregivers in your first 3 years of life. And what the research shows, and this is research that was developed by John Bowlby in the 60s and has been proven more and more and more true as time has gone on. There's tens of thousands of articles and studies, but the attachment research shows us that if you grow up in an environment where your caregivers are attuned, attentive, and present or near, then you, for those first 3 years of life, then the chances are is that you will be more securely attached later on in life. The research also shows that 18, well, as adults, 80% of us will have the same attachment style in adulthood that we had at 18 months of life. And so attunement is more so how our caregivers responded to us in times of distress, when we had distress, when we had dysregulation. So I think about my own kids, like when they're crying, when they're upset, when they're angry, how do I respond? How do I attune to them? Do I put them in another room because I can't deal with their crying right now? Do I yell at them and I'm like, I can't deal with you? Do I get really anxious in my own nervous system, which is like, what do? I'm really frantic. Do I completely disconnect and go into shutdown? A baby's nervous system is so incredibly vulnerable or a child's nervous system is very vulnerable in the first, we could say 5 to 6 years of life. It's not developed. And so through co-regulation, they actually borrow our nervous system for those first few years of life. And so if I have a system that is responding to your dysregulation with more dysregulation, I'm just going to make you more dysregulated. But if I have a nervous system and a response where you're crying, you're upset, and I attune to you with love, compassion, support, understanding, clarity, right? That co-regulation, then your system is going to, over time, grow into a more developed and regulated nervous system. So that sets the imprint for us throughout our life and how our nervous system develops. Self-attunement is kind of the same thing, but what we find is that the way that we attune to ourselves. So for instance, we see this a lot in the somatic space because, by the way, we've set this precedent in the world of healing and in the world of perfectionism that we're never allowed to be anxious. We're never allowed to be angry, or, oh my gosh, I have a flare up again. And that doesn't mean, in some ways, that actually means progress because your body's coming back online and allowing you to feel what maybe you couldn't feel back then. But because we have these high standards of ourselves, and maybe because of the way that we were attuned to back then, we can often get self-critical of our very normal emotional and somatic experiences. Why am I feeling anxiety again about like doing this one thing that I've been working on? Or like, gosh, why did I just like blow up on my kids again? Or why did I do this? Why did I do that? Why did I shut down in that moment? Why didn't I stick up for myself to my boss? Self-attuned. So that language, first of all, was learned. The way that we were attuned to as children creates the way that we attune to ourselves as adults. So the way that we talk to ourselves, the way that we react when we have very normal experiences, that was taught to us. That was modeled to us. And so self-attunement is trying to find and cultivate a more nurturing language where when we have moments where we are imperfect humans, because we are imperfect humans, right? It's like having like, yeah, I just felt anxious again. And can that be okay in this moment? Or yeah, like I got really upset about that. And can I just hold some clarity of like, yeah, that triggered this young part of me that really came up. Or yeah, I'm feeling that thing in my body. Right. So that the more that we can attune to ourselves with compassion and understanding, the easier it is for those things to be able to move through our body. Because when we resist it, when we judge it, when we war against ourselves, it actually creates much more dysregulation and increases our symptoms or whatever that experience even is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is, sort of become the parent that maybe you never had for yourself.
Yes.
Give yourself the attunement that you should have gotten, but now you have to learn how to give it to yourself.
Yes.
And, that language, also the way you talk to yourself, the way you allow yourself to feel the emotions, as you were saying as well, and not criticizing yourself or shutting them down, saying, oh, why am I so anxious? Why am I so awkward around people? Why am I blah, blah, blah? Like that acceptance is so transformational. I find acceptance of, who we are and the emotions we have, and just understanding that emotions aren't, forever. They come and go, they're waves. There was this research, I can't remember exactly the time, but basically said, you can only feel an emotion for a certain amount of time and then your body, needs, because the way we're
90
constructing needs to move
seconds.
on.
Yes, it's 90 seconds. It takes your
Mm.
body 90 seconds to metabolize an emotion if we allow it. But if we fight it, it takes a lot longer.
That
Yeah.
is so interesting in itself,
Yeah.
because it's like, you know, we're so scared of emotions because we think they're gonna last forever.
Mhm.
This sadness is gonna last forever, and I'm gonna lose myself in this sadness. I'm gonna lose control. And actually, if you actually allow yourself to feel it completely, it will go away in 90 seconds.
Yes, absolutely. It reminds me of, we have so we call this interrelational focusing work, kind of what we're talking about. And it's the way that we relate to our feelings that gets in the way of feeling our feelings. It's the
Mm,
feeling that we have about our feelings. And for so many of us, there's a lot of fear because maybe our feelings brought up a response that was really dangerous, or maybe it's that our feelings weren't met with validation or support or care. But that fear, we often find it's a mile wide. That fear, it's like in an ocean. It's a mile wide, but it's an inch deep. Like as soon as we step into it, we're like, oh, it's actually not that bad. Right.
mm.
So yeah, I think that's important to say. And what you were talking about with the self-attunement, it goes back to this saying of like everything about us makes sense. Right. Like when, I felt when I look at how I responded to that person when I felt anxious, I think is what you were mentioning. Like, yeah, that makes sense given what you've been through in the past. Or yeah, that makes sense because this person triggered this one thing in you. Um, and so I think having that perspective of like everything about us makes sense, I think can be really, really helpful.
I love it. And I use it so much with my clients as well. When they're critical, highly critical of themselves, I'm like, it makes sense for you to feel like this,
Yeah.
taking into consideration what you've been through. It makes total sense. And, you
Mhm.
can see them relaxing. So I think that's a really powerful, like, mindset switch.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, Something else I've kind of seen online a lot is this trend on TikTok, especially. I'm always doing research because I'm like a content creator, and you have to keep up with trends and stuff.
Hmm.
But it's people talking about losing their spark. And I know you have a section of the book where you talk about, you know, um, getting your life force back, or
Yeah.
your spark. So I'd love to know, how can you get your life force back or your spark?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is something that I dedicated, like you said, an entire chapter to in the book. And the chapter is called Rising into Your Power, um, and stepping into your life force and your healthy aggression. So when we talk about life force in the somatic experiencing framework, we're talking about, and actually in other frameworks as well, life force is healthy aggression. And it's a healthy fight response. And again, we've been conditioned as a society to look at anger as this bad, destructive thing. Um, and instead, when we look at kind of the evolution of anger and how it shows up again in animals, but also as in us, human animals, anger is incredibly important and it's necessary in a lot of ways. So the word aggression comes from the Latin joining of aggrete, which means to move forward or to propel. So it's our healthy aggression that actually propels us in life, that helps us to move forward, that helps us to like go after what we want. And if we've experienced anything in our life where our healthy aggression and our power was extinguished or diminished, right? Like it wasn't okay to have anger when I was a little child. It wasn't okay to set boundaries. Um, or, if we were taken advantage of at any point in our life, like our fight response can get thwarted. Or through, again, our modern culture, we've learned anger is not okay. And so what can happen is that as we grow into kind of our adult bodies, there becomes this procedural pattern or a muscle memory where as the experience of anger rises, right, or healthy aggression, which is adrenaline and cortisol, which is heat, which is maybe sweat, which is like a racing heart rate, our body might learn, nope, we push that down and we dissociate. or nope, we shut that right down and we go into shutdown response. And this can show up behaviorally where we are not going after the things that we want in our lives. We feel, and if you think about it, when we're not being propelled in life, we are becoming dormant, right? So we feel stuck. We're stuck in the same scenarios, in the same place, in the same experiences in life. And when we're dormant, we also can become a doormat to others, to life. When we don't have this healthy aggression, we cannot set boundaries. We cannot protect and defend, right? And so we find that we often fawn and people please and prioritize others. And so healthy aggression is so incredibly important. And if we learned early that we couldn't express anger in a healthy way, then we also, like, because it has to go somewhere, right? We often will express it inward. So we feel angry at
Mm.
ourselves. We're really self critical. We're judging of ourselves. Um, so yeah, it shows up behaviorally like that. But healthy aggression helps us to, number one, protect and defend, right? Like our traditional fight response. But it also helps us to play. So like if you think about young kids playing, or like my husband every night, I have a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, they do like, body slams on on the bed. Like they like to get like rough and tumble, but it's such a good like proprioceptive way for their nervous systems to like get out all that energy, because kids get zoomies at night. They get crazy, they're like wired and tired, and so that's our way of helping them get out some of that adrenaline and cortisol. But play is also like physical activity, right? When we're exercising, we have adrenaline, cortisol, we're playing. So protection, play, productivity. We need healthy aggression to be productive, to go after the things that we want, to propel us. And it also helps us to have passion, right? Like righteous passion about the things that are important to us, which helps us to advocate for the things that we want in the world, which helps us to have purpose and meaning. So yeah, the reason there's an entire chapter about power and life force and healthy aggression and what we call vitality is because it's something that I really struggled with in a lot of my life. I was anxious and I was a fawner, right? Like I pleased others. And I learned that a lot of that was because I had a lot of suppressed anger. Anger wasn't allowed, but there were also things that happened in my life that really thwarted my fight response. And so I had to start to cultivate a new relationship to anger, one that felt supportive and healthy and not scary. And it helped me to set better boundaries and all of those things. So we often think that regulation is about like calming down, but so much of it is going the other way, which is like rising into that power. Um, yeah.
Hmm. I think it's a big problem that people in the West have,
Mm,
in the US, in the UK, because where I come from, Eastern Europe, it's very socially acceptable to be angry.
I love that.
And that's why I'm very grateful. I have no problem with
Good.
expressing my anger, which
Yeah.
sometimes scares my English boyfriend off because he's the opposite.
I love that. That's
Yeah.
incredible. Okay, so you should do a workshop then on how to have healthy anger from an Eastern European perspective. I think that would be
Yeah,
amazing.
if you go to Eastern Europe, everyone's angry all the time,
Yeah.
and they're not scared to show
They're
it.
good.
Yeah.
They're fine. No, but I mean, there is so much science that's been coming out, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Gabor Mate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, love his work. I think everyone loves his work. He's phenomenal,
Yeah.
but he talks a lot about the suppression of anger. And again, thinking about that beach ball, right? The amount that it takes for us to suppress anger. Um, it starts to wear on us. And that's where like a lot of like our spark, right? When we're down in that dorsal place, like we're literally in a state of hibernation. Like we're not in our spark. We're not like living our life to the fullest. We're hiding in many ways. And
Mm.
I yeah, it's sad that a lot of people live their life like that. And we know too, a lot of the research shows that especially in women, women have higher rates of illness and disease when they have emotional suppression. And so I have seen that firsthand in my own family, the women in my family having multiple different medical diagnoses, cancer and heart attacks and strokes. And I think a lot of that is like, again, just kind of this armoring up against anger, pushing it down, pushing it away. So yeah, it can have some pretty devastating impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important to be able to learn to express it in a healthy way.
Yeah.
And, what are some somatic experiencing tools someone can use when they do feel angry?
Yeah. So, I came up with this 3-step kind of acronym for how to feel. Like, people ask me all the time, how do I feel a feeling? Right. And it's something that a lot of us like don't learn. Like, this is a language and a skill that I think that we assume comes naturally, and it really should, but there's so much in our world that keeps us really disconnected. So it's the 3 E's, and it is when we are working through some kind of emotion or somatic experience, we want to first be able to experience it, then see if there's a natural way that it gets expressed. So experience, express, which then leads to expelling of the adrenaline and cortisol. And so the first step for people, I think some people would assume, and what you see a lot in like mainstream social media is like punch a pillow or rage cry, or not rage cry, rage scream, or do something over the top to really tap into your anger, your primal anger. And although that can be supportive for some people, for some nervous systems, that can feel like too much, too fast, too soon. And you talk about the pressure cooker, like that is blowing the lid off the pressure cooker. That could overwhelm a nervous system. It could blow out a nervous system, and it could cause irreparable damage. Because you could be taking a nervous system into body memory that it's maybe not ready to be with yet. Right. So we don't want to do it too much. The first thing is, instead of jumping straight into expressing and expelling, that's why experiencing is important. When you experience, you just want to track. We call this interoception. You're just tracking in your body. How is my body showing me I'm angry right now? And then just observe yourself. Observe the sensations that happen internally. Observe the things that happen behaviorally from the body. So like, oh, I'm clenching my fists, or I'm tightening my jaw right now, or oh, I just raised my spine, right? You see a lot of kind of anger happens in kind of it's a top heavy activation. So you see it a lot in like the shoulder diaphragms and the thoracic and the respiratory diaphragms, in the cranial diaphragm. There's a lot of lifting and taking up space, right? So it's like, can I just notice that my body is taking up space right now? And even as I'm saying this, I literally have goosebumps. You see my
Oh my
goosebumps?
gosh. Wow.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, right. I'm feeling on edge. When we feel on edge, we usually get goosebumps, or, hair on the back of our neck. Now I feel heat. Now it feels like there's a rising in my chest, right? So it's just observing what your body does rather than trying to interrupt it, rather than trying to override it. Your body knows just like we said, 90 seconds. Your body knows exactly what to do, like if we just allow it to do it. So just noticing what naturally happens. And then the next question is, okay, and what happens next? And sometimes the nervous system will go into even more expression, right? Where it's like, oh, I just want to growl, or I'm noticing there's like this impulse. We want to look for impulses. There is an impulse to just like move my hands, or to stand up, or to start walking around the room, or pacing. Pacing is definitely a defensive orienting thing. Right. So we look for natural impulses. We don't exactly want to force them. And then as that natural impulse happens, that expression, then we track for a discharge, which is the expelling. So discharge can feel like tingling. It can feel like sweat, perspiration. It can feel like emoting, emotion, vocalizing, trembling, shaking, right? And these are all things that people who are in the Body First Healing program with me, on Mondays, we have like a nervous system gym call. So for 30 minutes, we touch in and out of activation. And this is all we do. We just track our activation, and we learn the language of our body. But what people find is that as they touch into it, over time of like doing this work, your system will gently be able to do more and more and more until it feels like, oh, yeah, now I'm naturally like when I feel angry in a moment, I don't have to like intentionally be like, okay, what am I experiencing, expressing, expelling? It starts to become autonomic and automatic. And that's why
Mm.
somatic experiencing is named experiencing. Because again, you cannot educate your way into regulation. You have to show and experience something different over time, which starts to change the impulse and the autonomic responses of the nervous system.
Mm.
That was a really long answer.
No, I loved it. I absolutely loved it, especially the part where, you said your body knows exactly what to do. So just like following those impulses.
Yeah.
And yeah, I can, sometimes feel like, oh, I just need to punch the air, and like it helps. It helps
Yes.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So you did ask for some exercises, and I guess it's important that I gave some of the context, but some exercises that you can do for anger would be things. So, like what I do with my kids is we do air screams, right? So we're not fully letting the vocal cords come into activation, right? But we are just doing like an air scream,
mm,
or you're just clenching your fists and
mm-hmm,
really tensing the muscles in the arms and then seeing, oh, release and see what happens, which is usually followed by heat or something like that. You can imagine an animal, like if you had what we call a competent protector that is an animal. For me, it's always a bear. It's always been a bear, especially now
mm,
that I'm a mom. Can you imagine a bear in this moment? Right. And when people do that, they usually notice as their animal, their body starts to change. You can also do heel pushes. So if you're sitting down, can you push your feet into the ground and just feel the leg muscles, especially the larger leg muscles in the body, start to contract and engage and then release and see what happens. And again, you're working with the body to gently touch into some of the defensive and protective impulses of fighting or fleeing that have maybe not been allowed to be there, right? That we didn't
mm-hmm.
feel safe enough to have there. And so these micro movements are really what are important. So those are some exercises you can do to kind of process some anger.
Yeah, and they're really, really helpful.
Yeah.
What about anxiety? What are some somatic tools someone can use for anxiety?
Yeah. So anxiety is really centered for most people, right? For some people, when they get anxiety, they go into shutdown. But for the majority of people, anxiety is really experienced in that flight response, right? This is usually where we experience fear, panic, worry, anxiety. And we have all that adrenaline and cortisol, right? And that has to go someplace. So with anxiety, some things that you can do from us, and again, you'd follow the experience, express, expel. But thinking of the flight or flee response or impulse in the body, you can again work with the limbs. So some things that I like to do is I like to sit on the edge of my seat and just allow the upper part of my body to lean forward into the legs. And again, think of it like you're sitting on the edge, like you're about to leave, you're about to escape, you're about to go, and just see
Yeah.
what happens. You can even come up on your toes. Another thing that you can do, and again, the fight or flight responses, we work a lot with limbs because when we go into a fight or flight response, the blood motility of the body actually goes outward to the limbs to propel us. Whereas in a shutdown response, it goes inward, the blood motility to our core to prepare us for hibernation. So we have all this extra circulation, which is why we're fidgety, which is why we're heated and red and, all of the things. So working with the limbs is really important. So this might be just allowing your, again, micro movement. So allowing the fingers to first just like slowly move, allowing the wrists to move. Like we're not just going into full like shaking unless you feel like you can. Okay. Like you have the capacity for that. Allowing very slow, gentle movements of the arms. And then with the feet, you can lift and do essentially running in place. So staying on your toes. Okay. You lift one foot, drop it. Lift the other foot, drop it. Lift one foot, drop it. Engage the muscles, right? This bilateral kind of stimulation and just see what what happens there. So again, these are exercises that you can do to discharge. And then there are exercises that you can do to really resource. And if it feels like too much, then you can always do orienting. Okay. So exploratory orienting is like really tapping into your sensory motor system, slowing it down because it's going to be really sped up. Your ears change, your eyes change, everything about your senses change when you go from state to state. And so, like for instance, in a fight or flight state, your lower ear muscles activate to hear the sounds of threat. And
Mm.
your middle ear muscles deactivate, which is the sound of human voices, right? So by intentionally working with your sensory motor system to like notice things very slowly, to hear things, to touch things, which is kinesthetic orienting, like I can touch this clip and I can feel the grooves. This helps the nervous system to regulate. So those are more so like regulating practices when it feels like too much and like, we don't want to discharge more because it feels not tolerable.
I love how practical all these
Yeah.
things are. And it's like, actually, small things people can do right now or in a moment when they feel overwhelmed. And it's
Yes.
so helpful. And what
Yeah.
about when you feel depressed or burned out? What are some tools for that moment?
Yeah. So, your state of dorsal is a state that we especially want to work very slowly. We call it titration, which are slow baby steps. And that's one of the founding kind of principles, you could say, of somatic experiencing. Um, Titration is a term that was created in the chemistry world where they have these little titration droppers where one drop of one solution falls into another solution. You're combining two elements, two solutions. And that one drop, there's a fizzle, a slight reaction, and then it settles. And then another drop, fizzle, settle, another drop, fizzle, settle. So those are called titration droppers, which is slow, tiny little steps. And when you work with the nervous system, it's kind of the same concept. We take slow, tolerable steps towards healing. We work very slow and gentle so as to not overwhelm the system more. Again, think that pressure cooker analogy. Um, so when we are especially coming out of dorsal, we want to be extra titrated in doing that. Now, some of the first things that you can do, like before you're even moving up the ladder, is the first thing you want to focus on is like, how can I start to become more present in my body and in my environment? For some people, so there's three spaces that your nervous system is really tracking: internally in your body, externally with other nervous systems, and then outside in your external world. So we call this inside, outside, and between you and others. When you're in that state of dorsal, you're really disconnected: inside, outside, and between. And so being in dorsal, it might feel like a little too much to start like co-regulating and connecting with other nervous systems. So I think a more gentle approach, a more titrated approach is, how can I start connecting internally with my body? How can I start to feel more present? Because when you're in dorsal, there's higher levels of numbing hormones, which is why dissociation is so prevalent. So, temperature exposure, heat exposure, cold exposure, sensory stuff. Can you do tactile, like touching into the body? You can do a lot of self-touch is a great way of getting the body back online. So you can do certain holds, right? Like holding the head and the jaw, putting a hand on your forehead, doing what we call the Essie self hug, which is like placing one hand under your left armpit along the side of your heart on the rib cage, and then your left hand on your right shoulder. So it's the self hug. So you're feeling your heartbeat here, and then also just feeling the pressure of your hands, right? You can do body mapping, which is feeling the boundaries of your body, which is a containment exercise, kind of tapping the body. And then again, temperature exposure, going out into a new environment, taking yourself outside, doing some orienting, that can help you to connect with your external world as well. So those are the things that you want to do first in dorsal. We always say that when you're in a state of shutdown, the first order of business is always getting present in your body before you're moving up the ladder, because we don't want you to be dissociated and then going back up into fight or flight activation, right? Because that could overwhelm the system, and then you come back into an even deeper dissociation. So the first order of business is, how can I get present first before I actually move through this activation?
Very interesting. And I
Yeah.
want to ask about a very specific situation, which, a lot of people are anxious or afraid of it: public speaking. I know you approach this in your book, and I'd love to know, what are some things, someone can do to become less anxious when public speaking?
Yeah. I love that you asked this, because I do talk about it later in the book. There's a section in the book, which is essentially like resourcing and somatic practices for everyday experiences, and public speaking is one of them. But earlier in the book, I talk a lot about how fear of public speaking used to be one of my like crippling, crippling experiences. And I actually have been a public speaker now since 2012. And it was not easy at the beginning. I froze on stage a couple of times. I remember going to like these speaker groups called Toastmasters, which is where you go and you practice. Yeah, you practice
I've
public.
been, yeah.
Yeah. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous, but for speaking. It's everywhere. And because I remember my speaking agency being like, you really need to work through this fear. Like, we hired you to be a speaker and you freeze on stage. This is kind of an issue. So I wasn't trained to be a professional speaker. I just had a story to tell. And so, yes, those are two different things. And so, what I have found in doing the somatic work is that it's not necessary for me to try and calm down. When we have anxiety about something, there is a fear, right? And that fear is that flight response. So you start to feel like, oh gosh, I'm starting to like see black, or I'm starting to like freeze, or I'm starting to sweat and I feel really fidgety and my heart is racing. That's the adrenaline and cortisol doing what it's supposed to do. And so for me, I try to find ways to get that flight response out. So usually when I'm either backstage or in a green room, and I do roughly like 30 to 50 events every year. So I've gotten really
Wow.
good at this. I have a routine, but I will usually do some type of vocalizing. So I'll usually find a space to myself. And if I can, I will go into a bathroom and I'll just get out vocally through the mouth, like, and it just helps to kind of clear some of that out. Right. And it also, like, again, I'm just lifting the lid of the pressure cooker, because a lot of the fear is like, when I get up there and I speak, people aren't going to, I'm going to mess up, or people are going to judge me. For me, it's fear of judgment, which is a lot of my fear of abandonment stuff and all those things. So it's, how can I speak and be okay? So I allow some of that to come out. I do a lot of pacing to just kind of like get that out of my system. I also do like, I usually do some heel drops. So I'll like, as I'm standing, I'll lift up on my toes and drop down, lift, drop, lift, drop, lift, drop, and I'll do that usually for a minute, which allows my heart rate to kind of go up a little bit more. And then I usually catch my breath. After a run, you usually feel lighter. And so that's all the adrenaline and cortisol getting out. I might like shake my hands. So those are some things that I do to work out the activation. And then what's also important, for me at least, is I like to try and go out to the audience beforehand, or I'll go see, the person that's bringing me in, and I like to try and co-regulate. So I don't want to see the audience for the first time from a stage under a spotlight with a microphone wired on me. And so again, it's just one thing of like, let's take away the anticipatory fear of, oh gosh, what is this going to be? And let's go out and like, let's engage with people. Let's see their eyes. Let's talk to them so that my system knows like, you're safe and I can trust you with my story, or I can, whatever that is. Right. So co-regulation really helps for me a lot too, if there's any way to do that.
I'm definitely going to steal some of these tricks. These are amazing. Just
Yeah.
amazing advice, honestly. And my last question for today, is how can you stop yourself from people pleasing, or as you call it, fawning?
Yeah. Yeah. So fawning is,
Sorry,
you know,
fawning.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So there are some steps to this. I'm trying to think of like which order they should go in. So again, fawning, a lot of fawning is that when we people please, it's usually because we are sacrificing our own wants, our own needs for the sake of keeping the peace, right? So we're keeping the peace, but we're giving up what we want. And so the first thing we have to do is we first have to connect to, well, what do we want? Right. So a lot of like my clients that I work with in the Body First Healing program, and over the years, they're like, all I've ever known is putting other people first and their wants first. And I don't even know what my wants are. Like, I don't know what is authentic to me. And so the first step is in learning. And a lot of what we're talking about is setting boundaries and advocating. The first step in setting boundaries is, first of all, knowing what your boundaries are. What do you want? What do you not want? The second step is then, how do I communicate that? How do I set that? How do I express that? And then the third step is, then how do I maintain it? And so for some people, they might know what their boundaries are, but they don't know how to set it. For some people, they might know what their boundaries are, they know how to set them, but then, they don't maintain it. They take it back after like a week, right? And by the way, this takes time. It takes practice. It's not going to look perfect ever, right? But I guess maybe what I can speak to is just the first step. I can give some tips on like how to start to lean into and know like, what are my boundaries? So we don't want to do this from a conscious place, a cortical place. We want to do this from a subcortical, subconscious place. How is your body telling you yes? When you say yes to something, like when your boss reaches out and is like, "Hey, Jessica wasn't available." I don't know why I said Jessica. Jessica wasn't available to do this one thing, and I can also ask like Cindy as well. But I figured I'd check with you. Can you do this? Well, Cindy can do it, right? Let Cindy do it. Like, I got a lot on my plate. But instead, you immediately and impulsively write that email back. Yes. Pause. When there is an impulse, it is usually an instinct. And our instincts were learned early on. So we want to pause before the instinct and the impulse. And that's how we override what's authentic to us. So we actually want to go inward and say, how is my body showing me yes right now that I want to do that? And you might find that it's like, oh, well, there's maybe an absence of activation. Like, well, there's no constriction. It's not like I'm holding my breath. It's not like I'm frowning. It's not like I'm, catastrophizing about all the other things that I need to do. You want to explore what's happening in the body, right? And then if there's no activation, then okay, maybe it's a yes. And that's kind of the first step for people is, oh, well, there's an absence of education or of activation. There's an absence of it. And then as you get better at it, you'll then start to hear like what a yes actually is, where it's like, oh, I just sat up, and this is going to look so different for everyone. This is why we learn the language of your body and your nervous system. Well, I just kind of perked up, or my heart just fluttered a little bit, or like I smiled thinking about how much I would actually love to do that thing, or how much I want to connect with that person who was also working on this project. Or I feel warmness, or just really relaxed in my seat. So you want to learn your somatic cues. How does your body show you yes? And then how does your body show you no? A no, as we take time to pause the instinct or impulse, a no will be much louder than a yes at first. It'll be like, my heart is racing, or my stomach is actually dropping right now, or it's in knots, or there's constriction. There's like this lump in my throat, or I feel like my head is kind of closing in, or my shoulders and my posture just really kind of like hid, or I'm feeling really fidgety and it feels like fear. So that's the first step in people pleasing, is first of all, learning like, what's your language? What's your yes? What's your no? That's going to help you to determine what are your authentic boundaries. And then from there, you then take the next step of learning, how do I want to express that? And then how can I maintain it?
I love that. Brit, thank you so much for all of this, the amazing information and all the science and research you brought as well to back it up. And It's so practical. I absolutely love this episode. So thank you so, so much for it.
Thank you. I've been doing a lot of interviews, and this is probably one of my favorites. So thank you so much.
I love that.
Yeah,
Thank you so
yeah,
much.
for
I
just
feel so
creating
honored.
such a lovely space to talk. It's been so
Oh,
fun.
thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I'm so, so grateful to have had you on the podcast.
Me too.
Thank you.